All right. Welcome back to the It Bees Like That podcast. As always, I am your host, Chris. Today, I have a special guest. This is a man named David Hunter. David is a family law attorney in the city where I'm at, and he happens to be the attorney who represented me during my family court process, the dependency process that I speak so often and freely about. Um, I had initially an idea that I would write a book. That never got off the ground. I did always have a plan to interview David at some point because David is a person who, um, from the beginning, I appreciated a lot about David's approach, at least just with me. The direct approach that he used with me resonated with me. One of the things that was most impactful after I got my shit together and decided to take this thing to the next level, the message was clear: work hard, give me as an attorney shit that I can use, and I'll fight hard for you, and we'll make this thing happen. So that's what I did. That was my approach, and it worked out really well. Just based on my experience growing up and the messages I got from my dad, some of the more valuable things that I got from him um, have to do with direct communication. The reason he imparted that wisdom to me was growing up Black or mixed race in Whatcom County. Obviously, in the 80s, it was a different time. And he wanted me to be prepared for the differences in treatment that I would encounter. So he instilled in me the importance of speaking directly to the things that are on your mind, to whatever, whoever the individual might be. To do otherwise would be wasting your time. So when David used that approach with me, it resonated well. And the energy and fight that I received on David's part in representing me in my family court case, I really appreciated, which in turn built within me a significant and deep respect for the wisdom and experience that David uses in his approach with family law. So with that, I will pass it over to you, and you can answer some of these more basic questions about your background, early years of forms of activism, community action, and other ways that you impacted your community. You're muted, David. You're muted.
Probably just as well. So I'm only 23 years old, so I hardly have any information to impart.
All right.
Well, maybe that's not exactly accurate. So my history, as a general matter, I grew up in a family that had a lot of religion in it. My father was a minister, and he was active in the peace movement, both my mother and father. And so that kind of ended up with me as well. I started going to university in 1962. I was active in the civil rights movement. I did voter registration work in the South in 64, maybe 65. I was active in the anti-war movement, Vietnam anti-war movement, from 65 until, well, through 72.
So
those
you
were
were
interesting. Yeah,
you
sorry.
were boots on the ground during a time when a lot of those movements were brand new, and there were, I mean, we're talking about Black Panther movement, we're talking about protesting the war in Vietnam, we're talking about COINTELPRO, J. Edgar Hoover, and all his less than stellar endeavors, and all of these other crazy things, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I mean, that may be a little bit skewed from the timeline, but that was a really formative time in this country with regard to civil rights and Americans and especially minorities and allies defining themselves and finding a voice. That had to have been an amazing experience. I mean, maybe not so much then. When you're in the middle of it, it feels probably pretty chaotic, right? And maybe a bit scary, but looking back on it, you can say legitimately that you were a part of, you know, some of the formative years of civil rights in this country.
Well, I certainly was in the midst of it. Those were, from my perspective, not great times. They were troubling, lots of people being killed and damaged in a whole variety of ways. And um, I guess I felt like I had very, very little power to change that.
Mm,
Um, so I did what I did, um, and certainly the civil rights movement was important to me and my father. He was friends with Bayard Rustin, uh, who visited my house, my
wow.
parents' house. He was active in that, and kind of led me to be active as well.
Mm,
Um, so those times were interesting, but they are, and frankly, I feel we've made far less progress than
mm,
I might have hoped for.
mm,
I will say to you that probably my most probably the event that most excited me in the political realm, in the American political realm, was the election of Barack Obama as president.
mm,
Not because actually his politics and I were all that similar. He
mm,
was certainly more conservative than I was.
yeah.
But the idea of having a Black person elected as president of the United States was
I mean, what a departure from sit-ins and walking students to desegregated schools, you know, for first, second, and third times. Pretty
yeah.
crazy. It's a pretty stark contrast.
So certainly that is evidence of some progress,
Sure.
um, and that I guess still exists today. Although why we are struggling with people like Donald Trump are
Mm.
that is beyond my comprehension.
Well,
But
the just to not get too sidetracked, but to dovetail on that thought a bit. And this is, I think, if I understand what you're talking about with regard to progress in seeming like racism or racist and oppressive systems, ideas and things of the like, um, for lack of a better term, being extremely adaptive and the level of changeability and the ways in which they acclimate to new climates, new populations of people, um, seems in some people to develop or build such a strong sense of discouragement that we end up in our efforts maybe even taking some backward steps because we get highly emotional and we do things that maybe um, on the surface seem foolish but reactionary nonetheless. Where do you see progress with regard to any of those ideas from when you fought for them to when the generation that we're fighting for them now? What are the correlations and how do you think that we can capture some of that original active, that pure activist spirit that you had back in those days?
well, uh, you know, I, the first question you asked there had to do with uh, how do I see where we are today as opposed to where we were back then? And I guess I would say that I think that one of the realities is that there are certain things that just existed and seemed to be tolerated
Hmm.
back then, still exist, but are not tolerated. And so there are certain things that you can't say,
Right.
but they're still thought.
Right.
Um, but I don't think it is a minor thing that you can't say them.
Sure.
I mean, I think it is important for white folk to feel constrained, um, at least with regard to what they can say
Hmm.
about people who aren't like us.
Sure.
Um, and I think that's an improvement.
Yeah.
Uh, and and I think it will over time continue.
Yeah.
I remember that when there were arguments about segregation versus desegregation and segregation versus integration.
Hmm.
And I always took the position that integration was necessary and important
Hmm.
because that was the only way white people would come to understand that black people are not, not bizarre,
Sure.
peculiar.
Right.
They have basic fundamental interests like our own. All of us want to have a place to live. We
Hmm.
want to have a warm house. We have food to eat. Um, and, you know, there's nothing unexpected about all of that.
Yeah. I like that you bring that up because that's a point that I make a lot too. Um, when people, no matter wherever they're from or whatever, space they occupy, I don't know if it's human nature or if it's social training, but tend to highlight the differences. But I do try to do my best in those arguments to circle back to that point that you make, that black, brown, yellow, red, white alike, we all have the same basic fundamental need, which is to determine life for us, for ourselves, how we choose, without, obviously harming anyone else or another community, and just be left the hell alone, right? To live and determine happiness and success for ourselves without, obviously the addition of um, undue burden and obstacles that otherwise being a different color wouldn't exist. I do want to ask you before moving on about something that you said about the ideas versus the articulation or the verbalization of those ideas. How today it's more frowned upon. Um, how do we then, because I mean I have an idea and a method by which I attack these ideas. So how do we then, in your view, acknowledging first that people can think however the hell they want, no matter how smelly and undesirable those ideas and opinions might be. How do we then identify how those ideas manifest in behavior systems, and then impact people like myself or other minority populations? One way that I do that is having the same conversations over time and running the risk and often being singled out and deemed difficult and challenging to be around and having less than popular ideas and people being like, oh shit, this guy again, because over and over I highlight, these default positions into conversations, no matter the context or idea, right? Like gendering a conversation or just the presumption of one thing over another just because that's what's been disseminated as truth, right? So that's the way that I do it. How do you feel that we, in your opinion, combat these ideas that aren't spoken but still thought?
Well, so I think one of the realities is that people like myself, um, that is, white guys, uh, don't really get that. So,
Mm,
when there are certain things that are said or acted on in non-aggressive ways,
mm,
we may not even notice them and not recognize them. So I think to a large extent, we have to rely on folks who are experiencing that
yeah,
to make it clear to us it's happening. And in terms of how we respond to that, I think there are two things we have to do. One, we have to not do it ourselves.
sure.
Uh, but second, we need to co- communicate within our own community how really unacceptable that is
Mm,
and how problematic it is. And we
agreed.
just have to do that again and again.
Yeah.
And, I don't know. I do it sometimes. I probably fail to do it sometimes. And you just have to keep
Of
plugging
course.
away.
And that's completely reasonable. And I feel like that just itself is a human experience. And I think to be expected. No single one of us has like, I mean, maybe, I don't know many or any, where they have the just seemingly endless energy to at every turn and ability to identify in every instance the presence of these ideas, behaviors, and systems, and et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes people get tired. Sometimes, I mean, we all make mistakes. So I think that the fallibility of one can be made up for by the efforts of many. So as many people getting on the same page for the same cause consistently, I think is where we make a big difference, right? So I don't think that there's a like a significant, what am I looking for? Detriment or flaw to any single individual's character or efforts, whether they be ally or activist, in those instances where we don't activate. Because sometimes you just don't see what you don't see, right? Um, I think I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So we talked a bit about the law. You represented me in my dependency case. So why the law and why family law?
Well, so first of all, there was a point in my life back in, I would say 1978, when I was trying to decide what I was going to do. I was going to either pursue a PhD in English literature, which I love
Mm,
and enjoyed in lots of different ways, or I was going to get a law degree. I was going to get a law degree because I had this experience uh, in which I was involved in um, an employment situation, my wife and I, uh, in which there was an effort to organize
mm,
it was a restaurant, the local restaurant in Bloomington, Indiana. And uh, there was a vote. The vote went slightly in favor of organizing. And then that company brought in some high-powered lawyers, and
mm,
those lawyers managed to break it down. And from that experience, I thought to myself, first of all, that really pisses me off.
yeah.
Um, and, it seemed to me that there were people, not that this was a new idea for me, but people who get beaten simply because they don't have the right resources.
Mm,
And I thought, that's something I could do. I could become a lawyer and work in the labor field or something like that.
mm,
So ultimately, I decided to become a lawyer, and I did that. I thought I was going to end up with the National Labor Relations Board, but then Ronald Reagan came on board,
Hmm.
a nightmare of all of his own. And he brought with him Clarence Thomas.
Hmm.
And I didn't get the National Labor Relations Board stopped hiring because Ronald Reagan didn't care about them and didn't fund them. And I had an opportunity to get employment with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I took that.
Hmm.
And then Clarence Thomas became the director of that. And it just became a nightmare. So I left that and went to work with Public Defender's Office in Bloomington, Indiana. My intent at all times while I was a lawyer was to represent people who lacked resources. And I've done that ever since. Incidentally, it's not, you describe my work as family law. I do dependency law,
Okay.
and they are different,
Okay.
though they involve families for sure. But family law tends to involve divorces and
Okay. That makes
you know,
sense.
parenting plans and that sort of thing.
Sure.
So that's what I've done. And when the dependency position became open and somebody recommended me for that, I took it. And that was a lot of years ago. And I've done that ever since. And I've found it to be fascinating,
Hmm.
certainly stressful,
Sure.
but it 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 does what I want to do, and that is give people who don't have resources some chance to find a place for themselves
That's awesome.
and get their kids back.
Yeah. It's extremely important work. And when I think about the way when it happens that it used to happen more like during the process or like directly after it was over, where my mind would spiral on different what ifs. So what if I didn't meet David? What if this happened? What if the trajectory of the case went this way? Or what if this happened? And I think about some of the people who just during my process where I would be waiting to be heard, and listening to some of the details of their case, where maybe a parent would their rights were being terminated, or they didn't show up, or one other, name insert heartbreaking situation, right? And it in those instances it would terrify me. And then in the quiet moments, in my well, not in my mind, but when I'm still and it's night and I'm trying to quiet my mind, but I'm unsuccessful. These are the kinds of things, like these intrusive thoughts, these what if thoughts. Um, so supremely grateful for the experience that I had with you. And I do think that, and to get a little hippified on you, but I am from Bellingham, so I come by this honestly. I have a feeling and a belief that spirit energy recognizes each other, right? When there are commonalities there as far as energy goes. Ask me to explain that, and I don't think that I can go much further than that, but the the connection that I felt with you was one that made me feel like I could trust you. I was secure in the things that you would tell me. I believed those things. And over, that was a repeatable process, because over and over, the advice and the guidance that you would give me during our dependency process, I would implement those things, albeit sometimes begrudgingly. And then the outcome would be favorable or successful, and sometimes in other instances would be beyond what was expected by either one of us. For that, I would say thank you. How many, just from dependency law? I mean, you can fold in your entire experience, but just in regards to dependency law, how many cases have you represented?
Oh my God. Uh, I honestly have no idea.
That's probably a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine. Certainly in dependencies, I've done hundreds and hundreds of cases,
Yeah,
but I don't know how many hundreds.
yeah.
And before that, I had lots of other cases, criminal
Sure.
cases.
So we'll suffice it to say it's expansive, the experience. All
That's the
right.
thing about getting old. You have more experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with most things, you hit a saturation point. You just stop measuring, stop counting, right? Like you're just in it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, let me see. In your experience and observation, which are or what happens to be some of or one of the most significant barriers to activation? What I mean by activation is just like parents engaging, whether it be early in the dependency process or months in or whatever. Just in general, what do you see as being the thing that impacts people as a barrier in this way the most?
Well, I think that for parents in dependencies, the prime thing that happens is they are overwhelmed
Mm,
and terrified.
sure.
Um, the enormous power of the state is being brought on them, and the most terrifying thing has occurred.
Mm,
Their children have been removed from them. Their
yeah,
control and connection to their children has been removed. That I think that debilitates almost everyone.
mm,
So, when I get parents initially, I I just expect that to have happened.
sure.
I mean, I expect them to feel that way. And more than anything else, what has to happen is we, attorneys, parents, social workers, we have to figure out a way to to invigorate them, to give
Sure.
them a sense of there is a possibility, there is a way out of this.
Sure.
It doesn't always work. For sure, some parents are never able to get together the resources they need to accomplish that.
Right.
But that's what we have to do.
So one thing that stood out to me there, and yeah, I would say among the other things that we could talk about, that initially that shock and just like feeling that you're staring at a 75-foot tall cyclops with 80 arms, and an army of the like behind them. What the hell do I do here? It's fight or flight. And most people in circumstances like that, I mean, it's a polarizing experience. So there aren't a lot of uncommon reactions, I would guess. But something that I appreciate that you said, um, what it means to me is the importance of empowering people, right? Because your ability with me to come in and temper all of those wild and chaotic and large emotions and be like, look, let's just slow all this shit down. Let's take it bit by bit. Let's identify what's going on here. Let's identify what's going on here, and let's see and evaluate what we can do in each of these cases. Because there's no sense in borrowing trouble from any of the other situations or circumstances that we can't do anything or activate about. That for me, I think, well, I don't think I know, was some of the most important advice and guidance. Um, Now I know, so this happens to be, I can't speak for other parents. Um, so I don't know statistically what we would even define as success in dependency, because for some people, just showing up for court, that's a win. Just making it to an evaluation, that's a success. but thanks. Pardon me. Allergies. Well, we were sniffling, going crazy, so I had to get some assistance with that. Where was I going with that? Empowering people. So slowing stuff down, providing people with the guidance and a framework for success. While subjectively success looks different, it can be defined differently. Ultimately, yeah, reunification is the goal. We want people to be reunited with their families. When I don't know if you remember this, but there was a meeting that I think maybe an SPM or FTDM that you and I went to, and it was pretty intense. And at the end of it, we were standing outside, and you gave me some pretty. I don't like to use the word tough love because I think that just speaking directly to people has a tremendous value. I try my best to do that. So you spoke really directly to a couple of issues, and I heard what you were saying, and I had no choice in that moment but to receive it, and try to compartmentalize my emotion from the logical steps that I needed to take, which you were trying to guide me through. And I remember, you may not remember this, but I do. This is a very clear memory for me. I looked at you and I said, I don't know about the other men that you've represented, but I'm different. I'm going to do this shit and I'm going to get my kids back. And what struck me in that moment, it wasn't that it was anticlimactic, but it was, you have a way of delivering messages that are so simple and succinct and poignant without like over dramatization. There's no need to secure different feelings and emotions, but you just looked at me and said, okay. And I was like, this guy, I couldn't imagine in that moment the number of times that you probably had that exact same conversation with other parents. But I felt like that so far you've given me such good guidance that not only did I, obviously I owed it to myself and my family to get this stuff done and make a success out of it and reunite my family, but I honestly felt like that the value that your efforts and guidance and advice added to my life, I owed a bit of that energy to you too. um when we talk about empowering people, as long as you've been doing this, you've had to have like struggled finding a way. I mean, obviously there's no cookie cutter application for each individual person. People are different. But where do you find the most success when, I mean, in that really difficult time, trying to get people to slow down, provide them with that just right amount of encouragement to empower them to step back and be like, all right, this is intense, but I need to get this shit done.
Well, I don't know that there's I don't. So there, we have 4 attorneys here in Whatcom County who do this work, and each of us has our own approach to things.
Hmm.
I don't think this is an intentional approach, but I tend to be, I think, pretty low key, perhaps a little slower than people would like. That is, in terms of the way I talk and um, act. But I think that there are parents who find that helpful,
Mm-hmm.
um, to, to help them to. And the other thing is, I say with a good deal of confidence initially that this will work out,
Mm-hmm.
that we can get this done.
You said that to me.
Yeah. And sometimes I'm more confident of that than others,
Mm.
but I start out with the presumption that parents are desperate to get their kids back. I am anxious to make that happen, and that collectively we can accomplish that. And I try and get parents to feel that I feel that way. But you know, I think that works for some people. Maybe
Sure.
Certainly doesn't for others.
Yeah. Let's see. So this is, I don't know if you have this experience in your life, but I certainly do. Especially since entering professional spaces and holding the amount of self-awareness and confidence and power that I do, never claiming to know everything. But I do say this, the things that I do know based on my experience, I know pretty damn well. So there aren't in some circumstances, or there may not be as much room in some circumstances for me to bend on some of my positions. One of those is, and this is based on, I'm talking about drugs and addiction and instability have been a part of my life since before I could form words. So personally in my life, in addiction and substance use and abuse, nothing substantial with regard to success or transformational change ever happened on this side of abstinence, meaning without arresting that and entering at least into the beginning stages, speaking for myself, nobody else, at least entering into the beginning and initial stages of abstinence and recovery, meaning I'm practicing spiritual principles in my life. I'm grateful. I'm humble. I'm doing step work. I'm being of service to other addicts and alcoholics, all of the stuff that we do in recovery. Without doing that, I can't, I've not seen, like I say, any substantial movement or anything that looks like transformational change without that completely being in place. Now, there happens to be now more than ever, because the face of drug culture is changing, the knowledge and science behind addiction is changing. I happen to be kind of on the cusp of like the old school Bill W. and now the more medical model and science-based approaches and even some more progressive approaches with that don't include a higher power. I don't attach myself to those. But there is a percentage of the population who believes with regard to dependency stuff or CPS involvement, that complete abstinence and is not synonymous with safety. I wouldn't say that I would completely disagree with that. What I would offer in place of an argument against, for or against that, would be my perspective as a little boy from experience. My dad was addicted to crack. And so that meant that food instability, summers without power, prostitutes around, domestic violence, all of this stuff. I saw a lot of this stuff. My dad, to me, wasn't a violent person. I don't know which is worse, physical violence or the absence of any kind of emotional connection. Both, I think, are extremely damaging. The later being more what my experience looked like. Now, that coldness ratcheted up significantly when my dad would use. So when he smoked crack and what I used to call the funny smelling stuff, that was when I was most terrified of my dad. And in those times during my childhood, from the times I could form memories to about 9 or 10 years old, when that happened, I have clear memories to this day of a strong desire to be as small and invisible and imperceivable as humanly possible, and even daydreamed that I could turn into an insect or a small bird or bug and escape the apartment and, you know, get away from all of this chaos which made up my life, which could open up an argument and debate about that, the trauma that can be attached to those experiences, the trauma that can be attached to removal. What I will say in closing to that is I don't think that drug use and addiction itself warrants children being removed. I don't. I do believe and I fully support the 100% recovery and healing of an individual and a parent. My kids would relay messages to me about how they felt about me when I used. And they were the same messages, same feelings that I had when I was a little boy, when my dad used. I couldn't hear that from my kids for a long time until I grew into a space where I could make the connection between myself as a child and my children. When I did that, my entire psychology and thought process around the whole thing changed. My ultimate point with saying all of this is for me, in my experience, before I was addicted, until I was addicted, and now on this side of it, there's no degree of moderation that would have allowed any kind of progress or healing, or for us to be having this conversation right. That's just the type and form of addict and alcoholic that I am. I can't speak for other people. I know that I'm not unique in this way. There are millions of other people whose addiction and illness manifest in the same way. Early on, how important is it to get in? But before we even talk about removal, how important is it to get in and really wrap around these services and identify those things that are going to create the most substantial change and chance for success when we're talking about people healing and CPS being out of your lives, moving forward, rebuilding, growing into a different version, the best version of oneself?
Well, so certainly substance abuse is a huge factor in dependencies, and the department has historically operated on the presumption that if people are using drugs, they are unable to safely parent their children.
Mhm.
And of course, a lot of research has been done around that issue. I don't make any presumptions about what people can and can't do while they're using substances. So for me, all of this, goes back to something that I find enormously frustrating, and that is that there are millions of parents out there who are well off, who are comfortably well off, and who use substances, primarily alcohol, but others as well, on a regular day-to-day basis. And nobody ever thinks to remove that child.
Right.
And I have two thoughts about that. One, I think it's entirely possible that those children, in one sense, are safe. I don't have any doubt that other factors play into those facts, and one of them is poverty.
Sure.
And so poverty mixed with substance abuse becomes a huge issue.
Yeah.
And so I'm reluctant to make any presumptions about what can be done if people can have a safe place to live, that is a residence where they have food on the table,
Sure.
and heat in their home and clean water. And if they use, I think it's entirely possible.
Sure.
To have safety. I will say, and you talked about this, I wonder what the consequences are for the connections between parents and children when parents are using and particularly when they use a lot.
Yeah.
Um, I think it is difficult. So, so I'm the world's most boring guy. I never had anything to drink. I never smoked anything,
Yeah.
not even cigarettes. I never. And so I don't really know what happens to people when they're using
Sure.
substances, except what I observe. But it seems to me that there are connections that get lost
Mhm.
as one becomes preoccupied with themselves in the use of substances.
Yeah.
My sense is that that's one of the things about substances is that it causes you to turn in on yourself a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then your connections to your children, I think, become less.
Sure. I so a combination of things that you said made me think about some things. Um, there are let me back up. There does exist, I believe that it would be hard to argue a spectrum, right? So based on various factors, socioeconomic status, race, age, whether or not this is a culture thing, like generational models of addiction in your family system, right? If on this end we have like just extreme poverty, and we're talking about uh, generational homelessness, um, economic insecurity, food insecurity, all of the stuff that comes with it. And then progressively as we go, we get, closer and closer to Beverly Hills. And then we have more wealth and resources. We don't even have to be rich in the traditional sense where we're thinking about zeros or commas in the bank account. Wealth can look like other things. It can look like having a large family that values privacy, right? Where grandma and grandpa will take in a child and keep everything in house. We're not going to talk about the addiction. We're going to, we're going to hide it. We're going to mask it as different things. Where when other people or families without that wealth don't have those options, it becomes the differences not only I think become more apparent, but like you say, the consequences um, in a lot of those cases become higher. The stakes become higher. When I say stuff like um, putting in place and wrapping around in individuals with this support and encouraging them and trying to guide them to empowerment, self-determination, and recovery and stuff like that. All of those things are outstanding, but the choice still ultimately rests on the individual, right? We have to at some point understand, and I talk about this really frequently. One of the things that was the most powerful for me in life was when it kind of like clicked on me, the immense power of my ability to choose for myself what it is that I want my life to look like. And it doesn't have to be a circumstance where in that moment I have everything lined up. I know all of the answers. I can see around corners and anticipate anything that might happen and have contingencies in place. I can just have a vision in my mind of the man that I want to be, practice being that person, and as time goes by, get closer and closer and closer. And, what do we do with that person? We want to give freely of our time and cheerfully be a love and service to our community and family. When we're talking just about self-determination, the obstacles seem from like when you're facing them insurmountable, even if it's just one. And with regard to substance abuse, without the stigma attached to it, how, I mean, if you were to try to speculate just as a thought experiment, how much more open do you think that parents might be if there were less stigma, less perceived chance for them being unfairly or unduly maligned for things that they feel like they may not have a certain amount of control over.
Well, I mean, I don't see any benefit to attaching stigma to substance abuse issues. Um, I see significant reasons for attaching stigma to certain kinds of behaviors.
Mm,
Um, for instance, with regard to their children, with regard to children.
yeah,
Um, so um, it seems to me that it is beneficial for people generally to not be hiding things because hiding things
mm,
feeds on itself. You
right,
become more and more anxious about what people don't know and more anxious that they may find out.
yeah,
And that creates all sorts of difficulties in coping with your lives.
indeed.
But so, you know, I see benefits to our recognizing that people who are addicted to substances are addicted to substances for a huge variety of reasons,
Sure.
and that we cannot begin ourselves to imagine what those might be.
Right.
Um, I mean, we can make guesses, but I've always assumed, again, because what do I know? You know, I just know
Mm,
what I watched. I'm assuming that for many people, it is an effort to avoid the suffering that exists within them.
sure.
And uh, it's easy for us to say, come on, own up
Right.
that I'm not experiencing that.
So I love that point. There is an idea, and it persists in a lot of crowds, that people addicted to drugs. I mean, this is nothing new. This is not an original thought by me. That they're lazy, they just want to have fun, they just want to feel good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What a lot of people don't recognize is that for most people, sure, there is that party phase where we're having fun, we're, doing whatever young people do. And it doesn't even have to be age related, but there is a period of time with use and abuse before addiction that things are fun. And yeah, we're chasing the thrill and excitement and the rush of, feeling socially attractive and funny and high spirited and euphoric and all of the things that come with it. But quicker for most, not so fast for others. There's no hard and fast rule, but there does reach a point in time where it stops. All of that kind of fun that is more typically pictured and associated with addiction doesn't happen to be the truth anymore. What then turns out to be the larger truth is people are just saying, well, it's not fun. You're sick more than you're high. You're not even really high, not in the way that you would be in the beginning. And I try to get that, I try to impart that to people, even since being in services and even like working at places like Detox. We're like, oh, they're drug seeking. Yeah, no shit. Oh, that's their solution, right? Like this is what they do. But you can look at them and just based on the physical cues, you can tell any reasonably minded person could determine that they're not feeling good. It's not a party anymore.
Right.
All right. I think one more question, maybe two. Um, so with regard to my dependency case, a lot of the progress that was made was in court. We didn't, I mean, here and there, the department would relent and like feel like they might toss us a bone, but most of it felt like intentional goal movement and hiding the ball, whatever. Um, most of the progress we made was in court. How typical is that? I mean, is that like pretty standard, like run-of-the-mill stuff, or is that more common for dads or specifically dads of color?
Well, I think again that for sure independencies um, race is an issue. Um, it's not coincidental that um, non-white people experience dependencies
Mm,
more than white people. Um, and I think there are a variety of reasons for that, some of which are economic, but some of them are related to presumptions that we in the dependency world, who are by and large white, um, presumptions we make,
mm,
even without knowing we've made them,
right.
about people of other colors. So, and in Whatcom County, it is hugely disproportionately Native
Mm-hmm.
population,
Yeah.
but also disproportionately Black. So I do think that exists. I do think there is also a presumption that men are less interested in caring for their children
Mm,
than are women. I have to say to you that my experience is that women have historically assumed the responsibilities for caring for children.
mm-hmm.
So I don't think that, I think that is a presumption that plays its way in dependencies.
Mm,
And so when you have fathers who are anxious and want to get their kids back because they love them and want to care for them, I think that there is some small amount of blowback
yeah.
with regard to that. But um, it so that the thing about race is, as in all segments of our society, a ever festering, unresolved wound in
Mm,
our nation. And I, I despair sometimes about our ability to resolve that.
sure. Let's see. All right. So when there was a point when I finally decided that, and that we talked about earlier, where I said, I'm going to do this, X, Y, and Z. I'm going to get my kids back. This is going to happen. In that moment, what I decided that I was going to do was it's not easy, or it's not difficult to determine where the bar has been set by um, the system. So I said to myself, okay, the system set the bar here. I'm going to set a standard for my daily life, my personal daily life, that is so incredibly high that this here will fold in so naturally, it won't even register like a speed bump. Um, in large part, that worked really, really effectively. I do recognize that certain circumstances and experiences out of my control, placed me in situations that had impacts on my life that even at the moment didn't drastically alter, the trajectory of my life at the time. Where what I mean by that is I continued to still make mistakes, and some of them were pretty severe. But nonetheless, carried these lessons and messages with me regardless. So I did come into the process with, I guess, I mean, and I don't want to sound like I take them for granted or that I don't appreciate them, but for what I understand to be um, the normative skills that either some other people don't have or haven't developed or haven't exercised or practiced for a long time. Because while at least early in the dependency process for me, where I was a lot more reactionary, and emotional and closer to um, abstinence and recovery than obviously later down the road. It became less and less difficult for me to navigate these like murky waters and like what I understand to be like bait and bash tactics. Not asking that there should be like an overall template and cookie cutter approach for every human being involved in the dependency process. But do you think that a similar approach for most individuals in the dependency process would be a valuable approach? Meaning prioritizing your life in that process in such a way that you say, all right, fuck, I don't want to do triple P, but I'm going to do it and I'm going to kick ass at it and I'm going to hand back these progress reports and they're going to be outstanding. I don't want to do UAs, but I'm not going to miss one of them. They're all going to be clean and, et cetera. And so goes the song.
Well, if you're asking me, wouldn't that be a great approach? The answer is yes. The the question always comes back to, do people have the resources to be able to do that? That is internally.
Sure.
And I mean, so what I observed in you as we were working on this was that you had enormous stamina, a good deal of intelligence, and a drive. And where that comes from, I do not know, but we can't hand that off to other people.
Right.
We can try and make it possible for them to find those resources in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
And you wrote a lot of stuff, good stuff, during the dependency, reports on a regular basis that I loved reading. I might have had to abridge it somewhat and handing it off, but there wasn't anything there that was wrong or wasn't really smart and on point. I just don't know how we. So at least as an attorney, and I think as a social worker, we have to find ways to give those people who are struggling resources. And sometimes they're just emotional resources. That may mean, okay, you don't have anybody else, but you can rely on me at least to listen to you and to care what happens to you. And that may be a starting point.
Sure. Yeah. I love that point, and that is the point where the cynic in me dies and the activist and support comes alive. And I don't think that I don't, and I don't feel naive in any way in my position on this, but I really do believe, because man, I look around and then just in my time in services, the people that I serve, and I'm talking about people that I've known from grade school and beyond, I very well could have, and I was in those positions in on that side of the table, accessing services and detoxes and emergency rooms and treatment centers and all of the community action agencies or whatever. Would I count myself fortunate for now being on this side? But that I believe that that power lives in people and every single person. I really do. I believe that that power and ability, whether lying dormant or in varying amounts and degrees of strength, it's there. Being able to operate in those relatively short amounts of time of willingness and opportunity, right? And acknowledging that in a lot of cases, an individual's grasp on hope is tenuous at best. And sometimes crossing our fingers is the best that we can do. But I believe that it's there in people. And I don't subscribe to an idea that there's just um a percentage of the world. Well, I mean, just statistically and mathematically, yeah, there are a percentage of us that just aren't going to make it. I get it. But that is not a reason based on mathematics that we can say, all right, well, based on these metrics, that's all you fuckers. Sorry about your luck. You guys, we're gonna really work with you and see what we can pull out of you. No, there's still a chance for any and everyone to that drive potential and that hunger to come alive. Whether or not we can capture it in time, I don't know, but that's where that spirit lives in me. So I have one final question for you, and I'll let you go. And thank you for letting me take some of your morning this morning. And this is probably going to be a question that annoys the shit out of you. I'm going to ask you anyway. If there would be one single bit of guidance you could give any parent entering the dependency process, I think we touched on this a bit earlier. If there was just anything, and I don't expect you to just prioritize one thing over the other and just say this is the gold standard, but just choosing right now, there's one bit of guidance for a parent newly into the process, highly emotional, reactive, sad, depressed, discouraged. What would that guidance be?
Well, my always the first thing I want to impart to a client of mine is in a way that they can believe this will work out.
Hmm. Simple as that. And that's powerful. And sometimes, like human beings, and I don't know where this ended for you, but there's this nervous and anxious tendency in a lot of us in services to um, fill space with things that are going to secure a person's feelings as much as humanly possible, and thus rescuing them from some of the more unpleasant experiences that those feelings that we have to ultimately process will bring. I think that's a mistake. And I want to say thank you for not doing that to me. Um, whether or not that was a difficult fight for you or not, I really appreciated you giving me the space and freedom to be in that moment, the exact amount of whatever it was that I had to be to get through whatever it was that was in front of me. And for the guidance that you and the fucking fight, man. I love watching you in court because David doesn't take any shit. I love it. I love that spirit of right is right and wrong is wrong. And when you have truth on your side, when you've got justice on your side, when you've got right on your side, there's not a whole lot you need to be afraid of. And I see truckloads of that spirit in you. And you gave a lot of that to me during our process. And I mean, anybody that asks, I always tell them about you when I talk about this process. I still count myself lucky and fortunate for you still being a part of my life. I'm still learning from you, and I appreciate your time here on the podcast today. All 46 of my viewers are going to enjoy this conversation, I hope. But if y'all didn't do it on the way in, do it on the way out. Hit that like, subscribe, and post notification bell so you can stay up to date on all of the fun, wacky, zany tomfoolery and veritable surplus of useful information here on that Bees Like That podcast. David, my friend, I appreciate you, and I'll talk to you soon, my friend.
Good talking to you.